David Weiss here, and you guys are watching PowerTec 10. Just as a reminder, this is the channel that tries very, very hard to give you the straight info. Now, it might be worth a small reminder here that this is part 2 of episode 138, which was the full breakdown on the AFR Enforcer head that we're testing here. Flow figures, chassis dyno figures, drag strip figures, etc. Anyway, what we're doing here is we're going to look at the portability of these AFR Enforcer heads for the average home do-it-yourself guy. And that's where we're at. Now, it's not going to be a very long video. The heads turned out to be very good for just simple porting work. So let's have at it. Here's a stock port. Put a bit too much hardener in this one, that's why it's pink. This is the modified port. Now, an important point here is that I ported these on the basis of a do-it-yourself at home deal without a Flowbench. This follows all the basic rules that I outline in my cylinder head book. This was not developed on the Flowbench, but it was developed from first principles as outlined in the book. So you can all do this. Now let me show you where I've changed it. Now I realize this is difficult to see, but let me just point it out. If you compare the after port, that's this one here, you can see, if you look carefully, that this here is a sharp line. Here it's a curve. Let me just point this out again. Let's illuminate it. This is the modified port, obviously. Sharp edge there, so that the fuel shears off it as it comes in and swirls this way. Here, AFR have replicated the form, except this here is a radius, because a sharp edge like this is difficult, if not impossible, to cast. So that's the difference there. Just take it out of the bowl here and here till you're left with a sharp edge like this. This part here is a kind of fuel directional generator, and this here is curved, and the guide boss is quite wide here. Now these are problems, or not so much problems, but these are the after effect of casting. You cannot cast sharp corners. So this port here has the limitations applied to the casting technology. Sure, they can cast accurately, but cannot cast sharp corners. So essentially what we did was cut the port pretty much as AFR would have cut it if they were making a CNC version. And the first thing we did was, now let me get round to this side of it here, is cut this part here so that we ended up with a sharp edge there. Also, the guide boss is skinned down. You can see that this is wider here than that there, and this is wider here than that there. Very little has come off the outside of the ports. Just clean them up. Now the top of the port here has been widened. See, if you look carefully, you'll see that it's wider than this here by about, oh, maybe 75 thousandths. Bit difficult to see. The bottom of the port, that's down here, the width at the bottom, has remained virtually unchanged, other than just to clean it up. A 60 grit emery roll was used to finish this off. Anyway, that's the differences on the top side here. Now let's look at the side view. As you can see in these two shots here, and I'll arrow them, that the short side turn has been slightly curved a little more. and it blends into the seat better. Again, these are limitations for a cast port versus cleaning it up. So that's a pretty big, generous short side turn there. So air continues to go around that until quite a decent valve lift before it separates. On the long side, this part here got deeper than this part here, as it did on this side here. You can probably see that difference there. This is much deeper here than there. As for the ends of the ports, not much difference at all. Now, volume of this port was 238, volume of this port 244, so 6 cc's came out. That's not an overpowering amount to do at home. Now let's take a look at the exhaust. Here we've got the 2 exhaust ports. Now the first thing to note here is that there's this little dimple in here, right, which is just kind of saving the day for casting. That's just to make sure it doesn't go through. Well, it can be taken out. The basic rule of skinny down the guide boss and streamline it was the job of the day. The ports got wider here where it goes by the valve and here, so that it's got more room to make up for the obstruction caused by the valve itself and the guide boss. As for, let's turn this over, as for everything else, you can see, and I'll zoom in close up, that it's much cleaner around the valve seat insert as it blends into the seat itself. And also the ported one again is deeper here and here. Now let's compare the width across there. I think you can probably see that okay. This here and here has more width to get by the guide. See, that's pretty thick by the guide there, and the guide boss has been skinned down here and streamlined. That's all that was done to it. That only went up by about 3 cc. So now you have a good plan of what was done to the port. Now let's take a look at a live port and see how that's been cut. Okay, that should light the port up reasonably well here. Let's take a look at it from here as well. Right, and nothing special done to it past about inch on down from the guide boss. Now I do want you to note that I haven't touched the chamber. 2 reasons for that. If you're porting at home, the most difficult to do is the combustion chamber around the valve seats. If you're doing the ports, it is quite easy to avoid actually hitting the seats. Not so with the chamber. So there is a little bit more to be had from this, but AFR have done a very good job of shaping the chamber to a near optimum shape. So it's not going to cost you anything to leave it. Well, it's Flowbench time. That means making a start on making a generous lead-in radii. Now, I always use a pretty big one here, but that's more to make sure I don't have too small a one. In practice, you don't need much more than about, quarter-inch radius, maybe a half-inch at the most. But it does need to be right on the edges of the port so that there's not a sharp edge there. Now what you're seeing here is the flow at 700 lift. You can see we had an absolutely solid 350 CFM. In fact, I think the lowest it went was about 352 and the highest at that lift about 354. However, I managed to squeeze out about another 30 thousandths lift out of this setup, and we actually got up to 300, I think it was 358. I don't think it would go much more, but who knows, it might have made 360 at 800. But that's an unrealistic lift for a street motor. 700 is also kind of bordering on an unrealistic lift, but it did go almost 350 at 680, which is, yeah, that's high for a street motor, but not unrealistic. By a good valve train with good springs and good dynamics on the cam, and you're in business. Okay, let's go to IOP Flowbench program. First, we hit the entry button and it brings us to this opening page. From there, we put in the flow numbers and all the details as you see listed in the various columns there. And the program automatically produces high quality graphs. That's all automated. These are the real things for publication quality. The big top end flow numbers I have just spoken of show up in this graph here. But as you can see, there's some pretty good flow numbers low down. But to best see those, we need to move on to the discharge coefficient. With the stock as cast AFR Enforcer head reaching 82% relatively early on in the lift range, we have a cylinder head here which has intrinsically very good flow efficiency numbers, and that applies throughout the range. However, the ported one reaches 87% and stays above the stock one pretty much all the way through the range for some fairly spectacular 71% flow efficiency at 750 lift. How come it's so good? Well, I have to say that 60 years of porting experience has given me probably a little bit of an edge on most people for blending seats into ports, and that's what I would attribute that to. If you're very careful putting a nice radius on the port and blending it into the seat, you can achieve this. If you're just a little wary of that, just stop short and accept the flow efficiency numbers that we see with the stock head. In other words, don't modify the seat any closer than maybe 30 thousandths from the first angle cut. Like the intake, the exhaust also proved very good, way above what we would expect as a normal standard for this kind of thing. Note that the top end flow, that's it, maybe 700, we actually achieved 88% flow efficiency. That is exceptionally good. Again, I need to emphasize that that top end flow was achieved only by very simple port mods. 76% for a as cast port is also exceptional. Now, again, the low end, which we got somewhere around about 86%, was probably once again due to the fact that I do have a lot of experience blending seats and ports. If you are at all concerned about this, do as I suggested for the intake and just blend the port to the bottom 60-degree cut, and you'll be doing just fine. Moving on to the intake port velocity, the all-important intake velocity, might I add, we find that this AFR head once again does very well. In spite of the fact that the port has been made bigger, the velocity has gone up because the flow has increased at a far greater rate than the port has increased, as can be seen by this velocity increase here. Now, in stock form, as cast by AFR, the velocity on these heads, the higher valve lifts, that could be expected from a high output street motor reached the magic 300 feet per second. I say magic because this is the number that SAE uses to calculate where peak power will occur. Now, it is the mean velocity. If the velocity is much less than this, as shown by this program, then we find that the port is not as efficient as it could be. If it's much over about 330, then you need to look at the fact that it could be made a little bit bigger to get a bit more flow and thus more energy. However, you can see on this that any lift figure above about 600, our basic porting job netted over 300 feet per second in port speed. That will get the job done when it comes to producing torque and top end horsepower. Now for exhaust port velocity. Here we find that without the aid of a Flowbench, it is possible to have an exhaust port which has maybe a little too much velocity. Take a look at this here and you will see that this port velocity gets up to 365. Somewhere around 330 is about as far as we need to go with this. What we'll find with this layout here is that whatever cam we use will tend to come on the cam a little bit sooner, and the low speed and mid-range torque will be up. But that port there may be causing us to sacrifice some top end. So next time I do a port like this, I will make that exhaust port bigger and see if I can get some better mid-range flow at the same time. Now let me interrupt what we're doing here for a little moment. We're pretty heavy into this cylinder head thing right now, this LS cylinder head from AFR. What else have I got on the cards here for people with engines other than LS engines? Well, I've got some very exciting stuff from TrickFlow. Two cylinder heads. One you're already familiar with from what Andy and I have done, and that's the TrickFlow head for the Ford mod motor. We're going to put a pair of heads on Andy's Crown Vic, which is his sleeper project. They are coming along nicely. I've got one done. Flow figures, I'm not even going to mention those, but they are good. And the other one is something that I started many years ago, and that is following TrickFlow's 280cc port big block heads. I tested some many years ago as cast and they were pretty damn good. Now I've got something special I want to show. We tested on a 482-inch big block. That's a big overbore. We found a good block, big overbore. Sneak preview. A shade over 1.4 foot-pounds per cube on a pump gas motor with 10.5 to 1 compression. Really good. That's coming up in the next couple of months. Lastly, I'm about a third of the way through my polyquad head for the Mustang. That should be pretty entertaining there, so keep an eye out for all that. And the last thing cylinder head related is I'm doing 2 episodes on how to use my Flowbench program. It will be step by step and show you everything this program will do. Now, aside from the cylinder head mods, I'm going to show you how to finish your bores off my way instead of how everybody else does it, and the justifications for it. So I'll be interested to see what Lake Speed says about this, but I'm going to be seeing him soon, so I will see what his thoughts are on it. Anyway, back to the cylinder head. Now I know that so far most of you are going to be fully aware of the terms we've used so far. That is flow, port flow efficiency, that's the CD, velocity, and we're now going to move on to one, or two in fact, that you may not be familiar with, and that is the port energy before and after, That means that if we've now got more port energy in our modified port, it is going to ram the cylinder better. It will also have the effect of having less tendency to reverse flow. Remember, I talked about reversion in a previous video. I think it was the last one or two back. Now, the same goes for the exhaust. If we have more energy on the outward direction, it is going to keep going in that direction longer than if it had less energy. Now, the last one we're going to look at is the port energy density. Now, I'm clumping these two together here. We use this for judgment of how good the port is how much port energy it has per square inch of valve per foot length of port. Now, I don't want somebody saying we haven't got ports a foot long. No, if you've got a half a foot long, then it's still whatever's in what would be in a foot of it, it would be half of what's in a foot of it, and so on. So it's proportional to the size of the port. Now, what this does is it allows the end user, that is the person using this program, to be able to analyze just how good their cylinder head is compared with any other type of cylinder head, be it a 2-valve, a 3-valve, 4-valve, or 5-valve, whatever. Whether it's a Formula One or a Cup car head, you can look and see what the maximum port energy density is that is achieved and compare yours with that. Whatever's the highest one is the best port. The higher the port energy density, the more horsepower your engine will make. Let's now take a look at those numbers. Well, it doesn't take much to see that we're up on both counts. The port energy on the intake and exhaust have gone up by a pretty respectable amount, so we can expect more ram charging and less reversion. As far as port energy density goes, we're looking good. The intake reads out at 27, and a decent cup car port from maybe 5 to 10 years ago comes out at about 28 to about 31. As for the exhaust, we are doing numbers right up there with typical cup car heads in terms of their effectiveness. Last on the agenda is swirl. Now, I have to say that the stock head as received from AFR was not exactly brilliant on swirl. Nothing much happened until about 500 lift, and then it went into pretty strong swirl mode, something like 2100 on my swirl meter. Now, the modified one was a little better, but not to any great extent. Up to around about 300 thousandths lift, we got up to about 250 RPM of swirl, whereas in the stock one it was near zero. After that, it dropped to zero. Got a clear cylinder there. We could see that the vane was just still, not moving. That persisted all the way to around about 550, and then it took off. 2200 RPM. Now, having swirl only at high lift and then going through a dead zone on the way up and on the way back doesn't do us any good, because the swirl is cancelled out more or less by the time it gets to low valve lift. Because the swirl is low, one of the things I can recommend for sure is that you pay attention to your quench clearance. Use the minimum possible. Now, I will be doing a video on quench clearance and the effects on horsepower and things like that shortly. But that's it for now. So, what's my summation on this cylinder head? It's great. I can definitely say, out of the box, it is good with the right camshaft. When it's ported, like I've shown here, and don't forget we haven't done the combustion chamber, because that's the potential area for you to screw up the valve seats. All I've done here is blend the valve seats in from the port side, and we've seen those results there. Now this has encouraged me to look at going further on the modifications here and see what I can do if I really focus on this. So that's down the road for now. I've got those other videos that I've mentioned earlier on that I have to focus on first. Well, that's it for now. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to subscribe. Do not forget to like. Do not forget to be notified. Share, and we wouldn't say no to one of those super thanks with a few bucks on it to help support our somewhat expensive test sessions here. Thank you for watching.